No. Yes. Yes. Perfect.
Now you're on. Wait. So do we have to turn ours on, or are they automatically
No.
on?
It's all on. Yeah. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Good morning, everybody here in Munich at the America House. I am honored that I can open this amazing panel on dealing with democratic backsliding this morning. And I must say, this is the third day of our Young Security Conference here happening in Munich and online. It has been an amazing adventure. Over the past 2 days, we had a first day of fellow sessions, so we had great discussions among scholars and our young professionals and young scholars here in Munich, which is part of our fellowship program. This morning also we had great fellow sessions, and yesterday afternoon we had great panels on many different topics, so check this out on our website, youngsecurity.com. And yes, this morning we have a lot to talk about because our public panel happening here deals with democratic backsliding, anticipating impacts, new fragilities, and old problems. And as we all know, old problems die hard, as we just mentioned with Muriel. And we have seen that over the past several years, and obviously we have seen that with Ukraine and Russia. We have seen that our perception in Europe that we can deal with interdependence, political interdependence, and economic interdependence leads that old problems come back. And as we know, democratic backsliding is taking place all over the world. It is a gradual democratic erosion that poses a threat to the world order and international security in many different ways. And it is also a problem because it is a long-term development. And one of the things that we also learned here in the West is that we had always a great problem with anticipating democratic backslidings, not only analyzing them and trying to find solutions to them. Obviously, these three aspects are part of the same development and the same problem, but we also tend to always focus on Poland and Hungary within the European Union because they pose an enormous challenge to us as Europeans and part of this union. But this process actually also takes place all over the world in different countries. And this has obviously a huge impact on international security and our world order and how we in the West actually can also deal with Ukraine. So we have a lot of things to talk about this morning. And we will try to focus on the new fragilities that developed over the past decade that emerged from this process of democratic backsliding around the world and how this affects international rule-based order and the current pressing security issues. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. I have distinguished professors here around me. And actually, I'm also very happy because we have a panel that introduces three different perspectives. We have a French representative on my right side, Muriel Rouillet. We have an American professor, Pamela Camara-Rowe. And we have Professor Stetter here from Munich and representing a more international perspective on conflicts and the international order as we try to grasp it right now. And I will shortly introduce my speakers. So on the left side, we have Professor Pamela Camara-Rowe, and she's a professor of political science at Kenyon College. And Pamela has taught comparative European and American politics at Kenyon since 1994. Her area of expertise includes American comparative political science, comparative European politics, politics of the European Union, democracy and inequality, the politics of social welfare, US Congress and policy making. And she has also been a congressional fellow at the US Senate, and she worked also at the German Economics Ministry at the Robert Bosch Foundation. Professor Muriel Rouillet, you are a professor of political science at the University of Nantes in France. You are a senior fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School. You've been visiting professor there of public policy from 2011 to 2018. And your areas of expertise include many things, including transformation and democracy and climate action, constitutionalism and democracy, rights, transnational mobilization through law, feminism in France, and European studies, among many others.
That's enough, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Professor Stetter, you are, since October 2008, Professor of International Politics and Conflict Studies at the University of the Armed Forces here in Munich. Your research focuses on theories of international politics in global modernity, especially from the historical sociological approach and social theoretical perspectives, empires and post-colonialism. If you know the title of our conference, then you see the link between our focus of research. International politics, conflicts and society in the Middle East, with a focus on Israel and Palestine specifically, and the EU external relations and the European neighborhood policy. Last but not least, also, Professor Stetter is also our academic advisor of the Young Security Conference since the very beginning, 4 years ago. And this is also is a little reminder that this is the fourth edition of the Young Security Conference happening here in Munich. And now I would like to start with our discussion, because we have so many things to talk about, and I will start with some questions regarding the current situation, to then describe how we can frame and understand the problems that we're facing right now regarding the shifting landscapes and what actually happens if we fail. Also regarding Ukraine, and what are potential instabilities emanating from this process. So I would like to ask Pamela my question, a big, complicated question, because if we look at the US and the current situation with regards to democratic instability and how this affects us all, what do you think about the midterms and the war in Ukraine right now from the American perspective?
So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here and also for the opportunity to talk about democratic backsliding, something that is near and dear to my heart and something I've been thinking about for quite a long time. I think given the current political situation and the kind of democratic backsliding that has occurred in the United States, and the current situation is about as good as we can expect. Right? And so let me explain that just a little bit. I mean, we've had a midterm election now without the kind of political violence that many had anticipated. And we also did not have the majority of election deniers elected in the way that also many had predicted. And that was a positive outcome. That said, there is still a lot of political violence and extremism in the United States, right, which poses a long-term threat to liberal democracy. If we take that, though, and so we look at the current administration, right, and the current politics that are going on, public support for the Ukraine war has been very strong since the war began. There was very little change in that public support between the outbreak of the war and the first-year anniversary, even though there's been a little bit of weakening of support more recently. But at least more than half of the people in the United States support the U.S.'s ongoing military weapons supply to Ukraine as defense against Russian forces, and also among both Democrats and Republicans. Right? There's a strong belief that Russia's attack on Ukraine was unjustified. And that's positive in terms of how we're moving forward. The second thing that you have to keep in mind with that is that Joe Biden's administration has shown strong support for Ukraine, for NATO, and also for the transatlantic alliance, and has worked very hard to try to reestablish those ties and the importance of those ties, particularly in light of the Russian-Ukraine war. Right? And the war has helped in that sense to unite the transatlantic alliance and to also show the importance of both NATO and the EU, and it has smoothed over at least some of the tensions that we saw under the Trump administration. And I think that that also is a very positive development. You have to also keep in mind that since the war began, the US government has contributed more than $75 billion, right, in military and humanitarian and financial support to the Ukraine, which is a huge contribution in terms of the kinds of support and assistance. And so that continues to be very important in terms of how that plays out. Now, that said, right, one of the problems is that there's no guarantee what will happen come the next election in November of 2024. There is still relatively strong support for Donald Trump, who will be, right now, is the leading candidate in the Republican field. Right? And so we don't have any idea whether or not, for example, Joe Biden will be reelected. And there are also some other more pressing issues, short-term issues that are going to come up, including the fact that it's possible next week that the US will default on its debt, which will lower confidence in the US's ability to continue to provide assistance. And while there have been convictions of a number of the protesters from January 6th, there's still a lot of extremism in the United States. And people who are also very loyal and very strong supporters of former President Trump. And I'm going to leave it at that.
That's already a good outlook, what we're facing right now from the American side. And what is so interesting, this panel connects America with France, and something that we never talk about in discussions, and we rarely see research on the Franco-American relationship since especially President Macron is in power. And there are some frictions. Everybody talks right now about his diplomatic moves, but coming back to our topic, democratic backsliding, Muriel, I would like to ask you, what do you think of the internal democratic backsliding in France?
Amélie, thank you. I'm not sure I'm the research you need on the transatlantic thing. I'll be the person who talks about it for now, and maybe later I'll produce a paper if that is interesting. So yeah, thank you very much. I want to say I really like the phrasing of this conference, anticipating impacts, new fragilities, and old problems, and I will certainly dig a bit into France's old problems, which are not new and which are coming back to the forefront again. So in terms of democratic backsliding, can I have the first picture, please? I brought a few pictures, just 4 pictures, which I think will be very telling, more than many words. In terms of democratic backsliding, you might think that France has been in chaos, as English tabloids sustained, a few weeks ago now. And so, if you don't see well this picture, what you see here is one of the streets of Paris, soiled by trash, because there were strikes. France was on strike once again, and it was difficult to even get or circulate by train or any public means of transportation in France. Amélie was afraid I might not be able to come because it's still, we still have hiccups because the problem has not been quite solved. And you may think, like many observers, international observers of France, that this is, your usual French mania to go out, take to the streets and contend. Contentious French, used to say Charles Tilly in a famous book. Yeah, right, yes, it's true. We like to demonstrate. This is ingrained in our constitutional history. We got our first republic through demonstrations. Not unlike the civil rights movement got advancement through big marches. And I want to make very clear that marches, demonstrations are, to me, political scientists, an entire part of freedom and of democracy. Right? I don't see this as a danger. It can be organized in a healthy, democratic way. And so this chaos, you might still think, was, the usual suspects. Well, I'm sorry to dissent on this common interpretation. The kind of deadlock and blockage we witnessed recently in France was due to a very stiff position of the government not entering into social dialogue with the trade unions, which all of them unanimously dissented and opposed his reform. So you might say, if you're Norwegian, if you're German, if you belong to any other country, well, it's not so bad to work after 45, to still work at 64 years of age. It's actually good, especially for women, because women, typically, they stop working more or less between the age of 20 or 50, and then they're happy to go back to work at 50. I got an interesting conversation with a Norwegian colleague who told me, well, in Norway, we work until 70, and we're happy about that. And I certainly would be happy if I could still work until 70 years of age, meaning that my super job, which is to talk with young people, is really a nice job, and I would be more than happy to continue doing this. It's not the case of everybody, as you know, in our capitalist economies, and in France in particular. And so the problem was less about this thing than about the way the reform was brought about, and the way the power, the government, the administration in place led its reform in a very autocratic way, using something that is legal, but less and less legitimate in France. And I'm going to ask you to show picture 2, please, which is le 49.3. 49.3 is the famous article in France of our constitution, so it's absolutely legal, no confusion here. We are still using democratic ways and constitutional ways. But this specific article is a measure of what we call in constitutional law rationalized parliamentarism, which has been a way for the drafters of the Fifth Republic Constitution to really tame and curtail parliamentarism, which was considered too hectic and ungovernable during the Third and Fourth Republic. So this is a measure of taming of parliament that has been included in the Fifth Republic, and that is part of our old problems in France. It's democratic, it's supposed to make democracy governable, whatever that means, and I think we could have an interesting debate about that. But it is also something that has made France depart from the rest of other European democracies and become a much more, strong man, presidentialist regime. And so as it is legal, of course, and this is the part of ambiguity that has allowed the government to sustain and continue stubbornly in this direction. We are being legal, you are not the people, you are just, dissenters and rebels, and this is sovereignty, this is the people's sovereignty. Well, yes, but not only. And so in terms of polls, which have been implemented, there have been polls all across this moment, this intense social heated moment, and the polls showed that about 70% of public opinion were not okay with the reform. Also, one has to be reminded that Macron too, because he has been re-elected recently, right, in a very specific political context, which was to counter Marine Le Pen, to counter forces of democratic backsliding. And he was elected with basically 27% of approval, of support, which is not a majority. And so we are dealing with a very bizarre situation where the government does not have full legitimacy, and especially not among the youth. Third picture, please. And here we come to what I call the decisionist turn in our current politics, and more widely, in the Fifth Republic. Emmanuel Macron, as early as his first mandate, has very openly said that he assumes a verticality of power, and that he doesn't like to explain too much his decisions. So, of course, in contrast with François Hollande, who was, perceived, including in the US, as hesitating all the time and not being able to really perform social dialogue, it's good. And I know Americans like strong leadership and decisive and clear decisions. It's nice, yes, you know who is in charge, and so you know who you can criticize for action. It's true, it's nice. But if you put this back in perspective in the history of France, I'm not so happy with this, because the decisionist turn of the Fifth Republic was a clear reaction to the errors of previous republics, but it also brings back, bad echoes of the Third Republic, of anti-parliamentary leagues, of craving for the strong providential man and leadership, which did not lead us very far, which led us to abandon and to just kill the Republic to the hands of the Nazis and Maréchal Pétain. So this path I don't like at all. And if we can move on to the last picture, please. This is a map provided by House of Freedom, a think tank that ranks democracies in the world, liberal democracies in the world every year. The blue, so the bluer and the darker bluer, the better, okay? And the redder, the worse. So if you look at Europe in the middle, very small area, you see that France is pale blue, hardly more democratic than Poland, and has been downgraded in terms of democratic freedoms and democratic practices. France is now, as the US are and as Poland is, a flawed democracy. And this is new. This has not happened under Marine Le Pen rule, but under Macron rule. And the big problem I have as a political philosopher, as a political theorist, is that you don't show strong leadership, engagement for freedom in the world if you curtail freedoms, if yourself you're not a democratic leader. And that is bad news, and I think this is the weak point of France today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Muriel. And so we see how our expectations of what democratic backsliding actually is, how this also conceives our opinion on it, because it's not only a Polish-Hungarian problem, it's also a problem of many other countries within the European Union and around the world. So I would like to ask Stefan regarding, going back to the internal EU backsliding affairs, and we have been dealing with this for a long time now. It's not a problem of yesterday. How do you foresee the EU's role as an influencer for liberal democracy and enlargement policies right now?
Okay, first of all, thanks for the invitation. I enjoy very much being here on this panel. It was extremely interesting to hear what the two of you had to say. And I think the good news about the EU is that there cannot really be a democratic backsliding on the EU level because the EU was never democratic in the first place. So that's something that has to be achieved in the future. But more seriously, your question was on what is the role of the EU as an influencer for liberal democracy and what is the role of enlargement. I think that's a tremendously important role. First of all, I would like to invite all of us to make this thought experiment that Eastern enlargement in 2004 would never have happened. And this was actually contested within the EU, for geopolitical reasons, basically. I think EU enlargement in 2004 had an extremely important influence on stabilizing democracy and liberalism in Europe. And democracy and liberalism is contested from the east to the west, from north to the south. That's obvious, but I think the EU as a governing model that integrates European states in one institutional setting and being liberal. If you read the EU treaties, it's very obvious that the EU is liberal democratic in its perspective. And I think that played a very important stabilizing role. And of course, the other dimension is NATO, which has been discussed as well. So from that perspective, I think the EU is very important, and this tells us something about the importance of future enlargements. That is something that the EU, and in my opinion also NATO, should actively do. Having a vacuum in Europe, I think, would be very dangerous. A vacuum which would be occupied by Moldova, Ukraine, and others. That's not a good and stable perspective. What we have seen, of course, in the last decade is that the EU has become more geopolitical in its ambition. And one of the fields on which this played out was Ukraine, the Maidan revolution in 2014, which was a reaction to closer accession of Ukraine to the European Union and how that was perceived in Russia. That is a big problem, but it also explains or is an explanation of why the EU has become much more active in its foreign and security policy. So that's the external dimension. I think internally we can talk about different member states in the European Union. We talked now about France. We very often talk about Hungary and Poland. A right-wing government has come to power in Italy. We don't know what happens in France in the next presidential election. Britain has left with a populist campaign. I think internally a lot has to be done in the European Union. And there I see many problems. And in a sense, these are also the old problems of the European Union, that the way the EU should look like is open to debate. And that's the case since the last 20 or 30 years. After the Maastricht Treaty has been decided and the EU was formally established as such, a debate came up immediately of how closer integration can be achieved under a constitutional umbrella. And this was rejected in the Netherlands and in France in referendums, and now that's a hot potato. Nobody wants to touch that. So what is happening at the European Union, and I think EU leaders should be very critical about that, and in particular the European public, is that the EU has a problem with democratic, maybe not backsliding, but with not very democratic decision-making. If you look at key decisions that have been taken, I think the balance is like positive, negative. The EU has been able to address the major crises it was confronted with. That was an internal institutional crisis because there was the idea to have a constitutional treaty that was rejected. The EU reacted pragmatically with the Lisbon Treaty. Yeah. And by and large, the Lisbon Treaty works well. Then came the sovereign debt crisis. Many said, you know, this euro experiment would never work, optimal currency area. So what you would have to have is shared welfare policies, etc., a shared budget. Wasn't true. The euro survived, and it's a strong currency, so the EU was able to react to this. There was what is called the migration crisis. It's a very problematic term because migrants are not a problem. These are people who seek, on the grounds of human rights, better life and should be protected and helped. But in a sense, it's a migration policy crisis because the EU cannot react collectively to this issue because of internal division. And one of the effects of this, I see two main effects, and I think they point to a big democracy problem at the EU level. One of them is that decision-making was taken from the proper procedures that the treaty foresee, in which you have the European Parliament involved, in which you have the Council of Ministers involved, the Commission, also national parliaments on some issues. This has been, and maybe this is similar to this your 49.3 dimension, it's too much is decided by the Council of Ministers and the heads of state and government. Powers, emergency powers are increasingly applied at the European Union level in order to address and solve problems. Now, this is fine because the other path is kind of deadlocked, so that's why they do this in the first place, but then you get used to. We just do executive decision-making by the leaders and bypass parliament, etc. And over time, this will become a big problem, I think, and it's not democratic. The other issue is that I think what we see, and it's backed up by polls, is that European integration has over time become a cleavage itself within the European Union. I think it's a problem in many places. That's the cleavage between cosmopolitan and communitarian perspectives, which underlies many, also in the US and Britain and elsewhere. What are the allegiances people have to their polity, to global issues in general? But in the EU, I think this is an issue of European integration, which is immensely supported by some parts of the population, but very much objected by others. And this is not addressed. This cleavage is there, but I think one of the main problems I see is that it is not really addressed. So you see, I think that is the because very often when we talk about democratic backsliding and the EU, we immediately talk about Hungary, Poland, maybe France, and others.
No, we
I
don't
think
talk
we
about
should look at the EU level.
You should look at France too.
Yeah, and we should look at the EU level itself and see how much Europeans are able to express European issues in struggles, demonstrations within the party system, and not much is moving there. Their issues are very often nationalized immediately. And that's why we come back to also losing some of the tremendous achievements in European integration, like the free movement of people. This will be gone in a few years, probably, because all other issues, the issues which are related to that, are deadlocked at the European level. And this deadlock can only be overcome with executive decision-making. But this creates problems of democratic legitimacy in the long run. So I just wanted to frame this issue. We can get deeper into this if we want, but that we very clearly see, and that is the point with which I would like to close this opening statement, that the EU has to address this because it's a model. I talked about the importance of the EU in stabilizing Central and Eastern Europe. I think this is true, but the EU is a larger model of how states can cooperate in regional settings, and that these regional organizations which emerge become democratic organizations. The EU is a big, big model for that. And that's why it's important to address this. The EU is doing so many things, and if I may say so, if something looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and walks like a duck, it presumably is one. And the EU it's a state, it's a political community in the way it walks, talks, and quacks. So it has to address this issue of how the EU can legitimize what it is doing in democratic terms. And this means having a balance of power between executive, legislature, judiciary. It has to have an open public that can have an influence on decision-making, get its voice heard, and it has to talk about its political identity. And I see problems in that, and I think this is a big issue that we need to address in the next 3 years.
Thank you very much. I would just, because we only have 1 hour and 15 minutes in total for this panel, so many things that we have to talk about, I would just like to ask you very, very quick, all of you three, in 2 sentences, if possible. Just what is for you the most important blind spot for you right now, Muriel, for example?
Very quickly, and as I hear my colleagues.
Muriel.
Blind spot for what?
The blind spot, what we just mentioned.
What are our blind spots? What do we need to address most urgently, right, today? Yeah. I would say, to me, the world has become interdependent in peace or war. And what we don't do quite well, inspired by the French experience, but also elsewhere, is to better connect internal politics and international politics. What happens at home impacts what happens in the world. What happens in the world impacts what happens at the world. And this is why I'm going to place this now, in case I don't have time. This is why leadership is very important, democratic collective leadership. And this is why this kind of conference is very useful. Because we should not expect too much from faraway bureaucracies, even French bureaucracy, even whatever bureaucracy is potentially a tyranny. And we need to counterbalance this tyrannic potential by the force of civil society, by the force of youth, by the force of the individual. And the real liberalism is there. It's about political freedom. So I think our leaders are forgetting completely about political freedom. Maybe not the US, actually. I would be more generous than you. But, you know, I see, I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit personal here. I've been living in the US for 10 years. I'm back since COVID in France. And I can't stand it. My French compatriots have forgotten to be free. They don't dare to discuss the state orders and commands. They love to behave like, prolongings of the state. They become themselves tools of the state in many bodies and administrative agencies. So it's I became more American than French, and maybe that's my problem now. But as you see, the world is very interdependent. And who knows what you will become tomorrow if you live here or there. It's difficult to be nationalist in today's world.
Right, so the blind spot, leadership. Pamela.
Okay. I want to come back to a point that Muriel had brought up before. And that is one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that liberal democratic regimes, no matter how long established they are not sustainable by themselves. You have to work at them. Yes. Right? It's not that liberal democracy somehow is established and then remains in place over time. Nor does it necessarily reach sort of a perfect endpoint. You're constantly working to improve it to meet the values that you hold under a liberal democratic regime. Right? So the US is not perfect in being able to meet this. France clearly isn't. And there is work that needs to be done. And people have to understand that there are obligations, responsibilities, sacrifices that have to be made in order to sustain liberal democratic regimes. And the other important point that you bring up too is that backsliding is also incremental, and it can often be done through legal means initially, right? You change electoral laws through a vote, a majority vote, right? You have a way of appointing judges, but you politicize the judiciary in a way that you put in people who have ideological perspectives. All of these undermine liberal democratic regimes, and you can justify perhaps each one of those different incremental changes. The problem is that over the long term, those are cumulative, and those undermine liberal democratic regimes from within. And I think that's an important point to remember. It also means we have to be observant, and to take that into account as we move forward, and we're looking at the kind of democratic backsliding that is occurring.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and also remember when we talk about this blind spot, that also people don't really know what is actually liberal democracy.
Absolutely true. Right, and there too, investments in civic education and in the educational system itself are very important. And we tend to forget, because we take for granted that everybody knows what a liberal democratic regime is. You live in a liberal democratic regime, of course, right? Oh, you know what it's about. But that's not necessarily the case. And I think that is very important to remember.
Thank you very much. Stefan, what do you think? What is our biggest blind spot right now regarding that?
I'd like to pick up on a point that Muriel mentioned as well. Actually, you sound like Tocqueville in your praise of the United.
Absolutely, I'm a pure Tocqueville. He was right, and nothing has changed since Tocqueville.
So you start to write the second volume then of his,
third, yeah, maybe I do that, in all modesty.
I think one important point that you addressed, and I would mention the same theme, the tune might be a bit different, but it's this linkage between the domestic and the international level. I think it's a blind spot for me is that we very often focus on democratic backsliding on the domestic level, but fail to make the connection with democratic backsliding at the international level. Now, I talked about the democracy at the supranational level of the EU. There is a lot of democracy at the EU level, but also some things are missing, as I said before. And obviously, in global governance, there's no democracy in the traditional sense. But liberal democratic issues are addressed, which are very important. There's a strong element of human rights in international law that affects the different governance regimes, addressing issues of climate change, a rule-based international multilateral order. I think, carries a lot of ideas that are linked to liberal democratic outlook. And this order is eroding as well, and it's attacked. It's under attack. And I think it's very important from a European perspective, from a transatlantic perspective, also from the perspective of many societies and people in the global south, to address this, because this order has, first of all, to be protected, and it has to be strengthened. And you know, there are linkages between the two. If this international rule-based order erodes, this has repercussions on the domestic level, and vice versa. So that for me is one of the blind spots. And the other one is that many of the democratic backsliding that we see is linked to nationalism, to very narrow ethno-national perspectives, as in the U.S. I think, you know, I'm an expert, but I follow U.S. politics closely, but not as an academic, more as a concerned person. So there's this nationalism in Europe. You see Viktor Orban with Greater Hungary, you know, all this stuff, but underlying, not all of nationalism and very narrow ethnic perspectives, are socio-economic problems. And they have to be addressed at the national level. People feel concerned and deprived, and these problems have to be addressed. Some of the opposition to migration in Europe is driven by nationalism and racism, but there's also a lot of fear, you know, of people who don't occupy the best jobs in society. And I think the same in the US. Trumpism is also kind of related to that. And these socioeconomic issues have to be addressed. We have to talk about the socioeconomic model at the national level and at the international level, and about these issues. It's very important. I remember Bill Clinton. It's the economy, stupid. This was kind of his election campaign in 1992. Focus on the economy, but from a social perspective, social justice, nationally and on a global level. I think is also a blind spot of this debate. Because if we don't do this, it becomes very difficult to explain the merits of the liberal democratic model.
Yes.
Right? And we have to address these issues, and of course, but I would agree with this education dimension as well. So these are my 2 points that I would throw in here in the basket for our discussion.
Yeah. So if we look at the shifting landscape, we often describe democratic backsliding as a shifting landscape, but as we also mentioned, there have been a lot of old problems that we got for a long, long time that are erupting right now. And obviously, Donald Trump is one of the examples where we can see a clear cut. Pamela, if we focus on, and if I try a little bit to connect the questions of the problems that we have within the European Union on the multipolar level, and also the questions of leadership. We look at the shifting landscape in the US. We have, obviously, on the one hand, the US role in the world, force for good, liberal democracy, and the US, which is, as you described at the beginning, much more in a sandwich position because it has to be on many, many different fronts, not only regarding the liberal democratic order and its role within that context, but also it has to strengthen the liberal democratic alliance. And as we also see in Ukraine right now, the US has such an important, major role in the international security framework right now, right? And how do you perceive the shifting landscape right now? From your perspective?
Yes, well, I think that's actually very important. It actually comes back to a point that Stefan raised, right? I mean, in part, you have to be able to show that liberal democratic regimes have benefits for the people, right, that live in those liberal democratic regimes, okay? And that goes to the socioeconomic level, right? That is putting investments in place, right, that are going to mitigate some of those economic securities that people feel they have, to addressing issues that people feel have been ignored, right, where they don't feel represented, and so they turn to protest leaders or to protest parties, and leaders find ways of mobilizing those grievances and those insecurities that people have and exploiting them, right, for political purposes, right? And you can see that happening in a number of the advanced industrialized democracies where political entrepreneurs have simply said, right, these people don't feel like they have been represented by mainstream parties, and therefore, right, we're going to try to exploit those and create this sort of narrative of, right, the real people versus, right, the established, right, elites and established regime. And you see it coming both out of the left and right. You see it coming out of the left, sort of against business elites and against capitalism. You see it coming out of the right, coming out against established elites that are in power, against pluralism, against multinationalism and multiculturalism, right? And so, but you have to be able to somehow address those issues so that people feel as if, right, this is a regime that actually benefits them and that helps to legitimate and strengthen liberal democracy. Because I think that's going to be really one of the very important things, and it plays out then internationally and will become even more important in this post-Ukraine conflict, right? Because we're seeing, right, China, it coming out of China, right, a different kind of narrative, right? You need that kind of more centralized state. You don't need sort of universal human rights. We should determine what the rights and what our regime looks like, right? And you have that kind of conflict between these more universal rights and those more sort of nationalistic type regimes. And so you have to show why universal individual rights and why liberalism and democracy are very important, because that's going to shape then that future international order. Right? And so I think that partly this has to be worked on internally in a number of these states so that we can do it. And then, right, the other aspect of this is strengthening, right, the alliances between liberal democratic states, right? And that has to happen regardless of who is elected next year in the United States, right? I think that it's extraordinarily important that those ties be worked on already now, right? So that that message about the importance of liberal democracy can get out, and that that also becomes, right, the narrative, that these are regimes that benefit people in terms of the protection of those liberal rights, protection of minority rights, in terms of prosperity over the long term. Sure, liberal democracies are messy and inefficient, right? We know that because there are lots of different interests and they have to be reconciled, and you have to come to collective decision making, right? And so in France, right, simply shutting those out and saying, oh, we're not going to talk to people about this because this is not where we're going to go, is not going to help that process. It's only going to make opposition to the regime more entrenched. And so that's, I think, where we're going to have to go in terms of sort of that shifting landscape, to sort of think about how do you promote, right, liberal democratic values and strengthen a liberal democratic alliance in order to create, right, a post or a new international liberal world order as well, rules-based order as well.
Yeah, right. I mean, we'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
And we will talk about the big question, what happens if Biden fails, and how can we then strengthen and maintain that cooperation independently of American leadership, if American leadership fails. But turning back to France and Macron's leadership.
So international leadership this time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the French, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, the French American relationship has always been difficult, and the French position towards the US. And how do you perceive that right now?
Right. So over the long haul, no big problem, right? We are strong historical allies. I think that's no question. And also Macron is very, all daring leaders in France take America as a model of strong leadership. They always want to reassure the US that they are strong leaders and that they're going to do things. So no worries on that long-term level. More recently, as you know, France got a bit upset because the American ally got a bit tough in the Pacific area and just discarded a previous security agreement with, between France and Australia and dragged Australia out of the deal, and that really upset many people in France. But what it does, and I'll be very scholarly, plain realist here, France tends to think that a multipolar order is possible. Realists think it's not possible. And realists also think that events prove theories. So I don't think I will develop much more than that. But there is a debate in international relations, and France has maybe is deluded, or maybe, you know, living on the legacy of de Gaulle, who, you know, really tried hard and succeeded because he was a great leader and had a lot of legitimacy, and it was like, you know, well, so Macron is trying to walk in his steps, and it's not always working. That's what I want to say. And I don't want to deny his international leadership. He does a lot, and he does it with conviction. And honestly, on international and European politics, I rather agree with his views. I mean, on Europe, more specifically. But I think in the international realm, well, France is a medium power who needs allies, and it should not choose the wrong allies. And so recently, Emmanuel Macron went to China and did something which was received a bit with mixed feelings in the public opinion, because he basically pandered to Xi Jinping, and he had to backtrack in a public discourse in The Hague. And it was not very clear whether he was advancing France's interests without, of course, European interests. And we know foreign policy is complex in the EU, but also what was he doing towards the US? That has been weird. And so he realized it. But honestly, so we have to go back to classics here. The world is a bit hectic now, and if you want to interpret it, you have several frames of thoughts. I'm not, you know, my professor at Sciences Po was Pierre Asner, who was a fantastic political philosopher, and who also a Kantian. He taught me all Kant and democratic peace, which I would like to go back to. But he also was pessimistic enough or realist enough to know that you can't dream your way out in this world, and so you have to be a bit, you know, conscious of constraints. And I think Macron, France is evolving in a severely constrained order now. We should not dream our way out. So we should be realistic and seek the realist, productive partners, and you know, be a bit path dependent on that, because I think this is the way of wisdom.
It's very interesting to see that also within the Franco-German setting, because France and Germany have obviously many synergies, but also many differences, especially when we look at the German word of the year, the Zeitenwende, and obviously many also think that the Zeitenwende never happened. Did it happen? And obviously on the military and security side, it happened. But Stefan, what do you think regarding Germany's influencer capacities right now within the current setting of the Ukraine war?
I think, but that was your argument as well, that the Zeitenwende has happened. I think in German security, defense policy has changed tremendously since the Ukraine war started. And this is very actively driven by Chancellor Scholz as well. So I think this is a big change. The biggest change for me is that foreign policy issues are discussed in the German public. Because for 2 decades, this hasn't been the case at all. You know, international politics has been very prominent, of course, in the 1970s with Ostpolitik. This was actually also part of, this was the main issue in election campaigns back then. But then, and then, you know, then the 1999 transformation in Central Eastern Europe, German unification was another issue. But then foreign policy completely disappeared. And this is also, again, a problem of democratic backsliding in the sense that something that is very important is not discussed politically. So chancellors increasingly, Schröder, Merkel in particular, became used to deciding on foreign policy as a separate field, which is not connected to the democratic or public debate in their home country. And I think this is changing now. And I think this is good because that's the first time that for the last decades that in the German public foreign policy issues, defense issues are actively, very actively discussed. And I think this is important because, as Muriel said, we live in this multipolar order. I think it's a multipolar order and it's going to stay like this. The EU has a very prominent role in that. But it's also very important to see that US power, it's that's why I'm very skeptical of this realist model, because it sets the states as units within the system, and there's not much else in that. So the EU is the US is very powerful. Of course, Washington D.C., the US president, and the US can do many things. You know, convincing the Australians to buy submarines from the US instead of France. So there's a lot of direct power that the EU can use, but Susan Strange has taught us that there's so much indirect power. So a lot of the power of the US is not really related to a specific actor, to Washington, D.C., but it's about the powers of the US that developed in many, many different networks. Finance, finance, credit, many, many different networks, and I think a lot of US power lies in that, but it's a power that cannot be used actively. So this resistance that China and that Russia have against the US, it's a bit tragic because they interpret this wholly as a geopolitical competition. And there's a lot of geopolitics in the world out there, and the EU wants to have its part in this geopolitical field as well, because how secure and how wealthy you are is very much related to that. But it's also tragic because a lot of US power and the power of the West doesn't come from this direct power, but from the indirect power that lies in networks. And these networks are actually linked to a liberal democratic society because they are based on free speech, on NGOs, on education, and people who can make use of their abilities to shape politics. And all international politics is no longer, if it ever was, 100% state-based. There's the state-based international politics, but also the one that comes from, you know, what networks are doing, in which people, NGOs, and others are embedded. And I think this is an important development that we have to address in that context. So this was a kind of detour now from your question on Zeitenwende, but only a small detour because I think if we talk about international politics, and so I'm very positive that the German public, because you asked about Germany, is now talking more about foreign policy and also develops an understanding of security defense policies, because this is an essential part of international politics. But if we get stuck in only interpreting this in geopolitical terms, that would be sad. So we have to have a more complete picture of what international politics is about. And then I'm optimistic that Zeitenwende was actually a useful and good thing to do.
That's very important to remember. And before I enter the two last rounds of questions, I would like to remind everybody here in Munich to prepare questions, and also online via Slido we have the opportunity to also pick up questions from our online audience. So, Stefan, you just mentioned the many powers and the interdependence and the aspect of globalization of international politics. But now I will just ask the question that kills. Pamela, what happens if, looking at the US, and you mentioned already the support of Ukraine and Americans, like shifting support for this war going on. But what happens if next year America fails? Biden fails.
America fails. Well, you're asking me whether Trump gets reelected or someone similar to Trump. It's not out of the realm of possibilities. Right now, right, about 53% of Republicans support him, which is the majority. But let me put in a note of caution there. One, we are far out from the presidential election. Many things can happen between now and then. And the other thing that focus groups and public opinion polls show is that Republicans are also open to considering other candidates. Now, it's not necessarily going to necessarily be better on the Republican side, right? But potentially, right? So I'm often a person of gloom and doom. I have German heritage; it comes with the territory. So, but I want to try. But I want to try to sort of first say something that's a little bit more positive in that regard, right? I think that one of the things that you have to keep in mind right now is that the majority of Republican leaders in Congress, okay, despite the fact that they are often at odds with the Democratic president, right, they support aid to Ukraine, okay? Those who are really in opposition to this, right, are in the minority, okay, right? And so even though some of them have loud voices, right, those who are in opposition, they're still not the majority of Republicans, okay? And even those who don't support, right, prolonged involvement with the Ukraine, okay? They're doing it for a variety, they oppose it for a variety of different reasons. So that even within the Republican Party leadership, there are differences, right? And it's not necessarily a unified, right, unified opposition you know, to an international rules-based order, which has also been an important part of the Republican Party, and you have to look at this historically, sort of the role that the Republican Party has played there, right? And, you know, Russian sympathizers within the Republican Party probably are a relative minority, okay? So that's important. Now, at the same time, there are lots of risks, right? So the war in Afghanistan, right, and the war in Iraq increased skepticism, right, towards foreign involvement in the United States. Trump's "America First" slogan resonates, right, among a lot of voters. If we look at public opinion polling in the United States, right, we see that many Americans who say, why are we spending so much money in Ukraine when there are so many domestic problems that need to be resolved? And I think that as the war goes on and as we get closer to the presidential election, this will be a risk, right, to the United States. You can argue that foreign policy is not, unlike in Germany, right, foreign policy is not an issue that is on the top of the minds of most Americans. For them, inflation, jobs in the economy, crime, immigration are much higher priorities. Maybe that provides Biden perhaps with some more maneuvering room in terms of Ukraine, but I think as we get closer to the election, right, we're going to see more of this, some Republican candidates saying, but you know, we shouldn't be spending so much money there. And you can see also that kind of partisan divide, right, between Republicans and Democrats, where a majority of Democrats say, yes, we're willing to make sacrifices to be able to be involved in this war in Ukraine, and right, we're willing to support it over a longer period of time, whereas others say, right, our commitment should be brief And I think the longer the war goes on, right, the more difficult it will be to convince the American public yet that they should continue to play a major role here. And this is where some of the real dangers lie as we move ahead, which is why the policies now and the support for Ukraine now become very important. But so too does the messaging and the explanations, going back to Muriel's point earlier, right? Leaders have a responsibility to explain to the public why we are pursuing the policies that we are and why they are so important. All right, because otherwise, and especially this is especially true in the foreign policy realm, where people have much less information, right, and understanding of what the stakes really are in terms of those policy issues and those kinds of policy decisions. I want to let others respond.
Muriel, I remember last year we also had a panel together, and we spoke about European sovereignty online because it was still the pandemic and it was complicated. But picking up a little bit what she mentioned right now, leadership and the potential instabilities, and also remembering this question of how the domestic interferes into the international, Macron and European sovereignty. He's a European leader. We were really fan of his European role for a long time. How do you see that, considering what you mentioned, that we have presidential elections, and it will be very difficult as well, and a very fragile situation.
So if you add the presidential campaign in France, it's still, in a way, it simplifies the matter, unless our vertical leader decides to run for re-election, which is currently forbidden by the Constitution. And if this happens, guys, you should worry for France. But I don't think it's going to happen. So let me put this aside for now and concentrate on the European sovereignty topic and what maybe Macron means there. It's a theme which is dear to his heart, I think. He really came, and I think he really triggered enthusiasm on his first election with a European dimension. So even if I'm very critical today, as you realize, I was fully, on with this. He moved. It is my generation. He speaks my language. It spoke my language of Europe, liberal Europe, 89, blah blah blah. This is all us. So I'm moved when I speak about this. So he did very well in the conquest of power. And this is part of his leadership, and he knows this. He also has a very good counselor, Clément Beaune, who wrote most of his speeches, and he's really good. And so this team, it's kind of rhetorically very convincing. We like it. It resonates in France. It reflects the best of what we want to do. That being said, European plus sovereignty equals big paradox, because Europe has renounced sovereignty in the sense that China or the US understand this term. The evidence is that we have rolled out death penalty within the EU, and this is the sign of absolute sovereignty, of absolute power in the internal realm. And sovereignty is also commonly still understood in the international realm, at least, not at least, but by every state in the world, as an absolute power that the others should never infringe. It's their absolute and equal right. So sovereignty is the equal rights of state, is the equal right of states in the world at the UN. And so this already this ensemble, sovereignty, European sovereignty, is a mismatch, because we constantly infringe each state's sovereignty to make compromises, to build the EU. So it's a very, very weird machine that we are building, and it's still very puzzling for Chinese people, especially. They really don't understand how this works, and so sometimes they despise us, and sometimes they look at us. Well, it works. So that being said, European sovereignty refers to concrete things, which I would equate to power. It's how to assert European power on the international stage, especially now that we have very clear threats and risks in the world. Of course, Ukraine war. So part of this is how to build a decent European defense. Sorry, I'm laughing because we know that this is a very debated topic, the famous topic of capabilities that the Americans have constantly brought about, even before Trump. Way before Trump. And well, this, I don't want to develop too much, but we developed a wonderful soft power, civilian power model, and we could concentrate on the welfare state because our American friends were nicely taking care of our hard security matters. And now this is a bit less the case, although I'm not sure it's so less the case. So, of course, this question cannot be posed without the American presence. And as you rightly said, Stéphane, I agree, I fully agree with you that Europe without America is not a good idea. A vacuum of power. This benevolent hegemon has kept on, you know, helping, building, and stabilizing Europe. And yes, it's been upsetting sometimes, but honestly, I want to mention a little anecdote. I teach in the west region of France, Brittany, you know, this horn of France is beneath the horn. And there's a city there called Saint-Nazaire, which is extremely American, pro-American. There are many American firms there, Cargill and stuff. And there's also a statue that I love. It's my favorite statue after Miss Liberty. It's called, it's the Sammy. It shows a young soldier, American soldier, a bit in the figure of Saint Michael, you know, killing the dragon. It's a very modest, frail statue in the Bay of Saint-Nazaire. And it shows how the Saint-Nazairian people are grateful to America. So, you know, I think it's a term full of ambiguity, but it plays out in climate action, let's say. And so this is a good topic as well, because it involves climate, you know, being more sober, controlling our emissions, but also becoming more independent from Russian gas, and by doing so, also fostering and developing our green technologies, which northern countries, Germany and the Nordic countries are very good at, and they have a very powerful role. And unexpectedly, Germany actually prompted huge progress through competition and through regulatory power. So it's a bit complex, but nevertheless, we have a strong incentive, because the risks now are transnational, to unite and do what we know how to do best. But to end my response, and we can go back at the problem, we are, again, very dependent on our partners in international trade. If we want, you know, if we want our model of society to succeed and to be viable, we need China to respect our values. How do we prompt China to respect our values? Sometimes, yeah, we can talk, hey, nice China, but maybe China does not respond to this soft language. And so we, again, we need to be online on the same page with America. We need support in the international system. We can't go our own way yet, and we are fundamentally, you know, a liberal power. So why unnecessarily mark our differences with our partners in these days? It's maybe not the most useful thing to do. Yeah, we can go back at this in detail if you want, but you get the picture. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, because we don't have so much time left, so we still need to address two very important questions, which is the global south and Ukraine. So going back to the question of potential instabilities and the current developments, Europe obviously has the capacity of living through the beginning of a type of Zeitenwende right now, hopefully. Stefan, considering the democratic backsliding processes right now and the authoritarian temptations we have also seen with many other countries in the Middle East, they have a huge influence, not only Ukraine and so many other developments around the world that affect us directly. Considering these processes and authoritarian temptations in the global south, what is your assessment of the current developments?
There's a pessimistic one if you turn to like Tunisia and other, where you have seen that there were experiments with becoming more liberal, and there's a backsliding there too, so that you might say, well, okay, that's a challenge. Also Brazil, the Bolsonaro, Lula issue. So this struggle is global, I think. And we should also be cautious of dividing the world into the liberal democratic and the authoritarian. That's certainly true with China after its nationalist turn under Xi Jinping. But many, many countries sit somewhere in between. And that is something we have to see. I think Zeitenwende is also happening on the European level. Sometimes it comes from national leaders like Macron with European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. But also the EU itself in its foreign policy has taken a much more global outlook the last 10 or 15 years. So the one turn in Zeitenwende of EU foreign politics was to speak more this language of geopolitics, as consecutive Commission presidents like Jean-Claude Juncker and Ursula von der Leyen have said. The EU should learn to talk realpolitik or geopolitics, and Borrell or Federica Mogherini, they said the same thing. So the EU has, I think, become more aware that it has to focus on its classical foreign policy, which was basically doing trade agreements, close political agreements, good governance agreements with third countries, but also more this geopolitical dimension. But the other element is that the EU has become, of European Zeitenwende in foreign politics, is that the EU has turned more global. Traditionally, EU foreign policy was only directed to the neighborhood, to states or groups of states in the European neighborhood. And what we see now, and this is not just happening at the EU level, but also by national leaders, that the Europeans try to create global networks and agreements. And I think this is very important, that the European Union connects to Latin America, connects to Africa, etc. And of course, the deals have to be good that are offered. They have to be on an eye level. And Europe shouldn't be afraid of the competition with China in that regard, the Belt and Road Initiative. But, countries accumulate debts vis-à-vis China. Do they really want to do that in the long run? So also, as we have said, that you have to explain foreign policy to your constituency and talk publicly about that. Europeans have to do the same in global and international setting. But they have to make this outreach. And part of this outreach certainly is geopolitical in the Indo-Pacific in particular. There's a lot going on in geopolitical terms that is also very important of how we assess the whole Ukraine situation. Part of the Ukraine situation is played out in the Indo-Pacific, right? Because this affects how China will assess what China's strategy will be in the next 10 or 15 years. But part of that is related to creating these global networks. And I think there's a chance for Europe or the West in that. There's the hardcore Western alliance, including Japan and Australia, but some sit in between, and this is the situation. It's not the same as during the Cold War, but the Cold War was, in a sense, it was bipolar, okay, but it was more than that, because there has been the non-aligned movement. And many, many countries during the Cold War, I would argue successfully, try to, remain out of that competition and keep sovereignty influence within that system, from India, Egypt, Yugoslavia, Indonesia, Gambia, and Ghana and others. So that was their strategy, and I think we see a similar pattern now. Many states in the global south, they don't want to align with either the US plus their European cousins, nor with the Chinese model in which Russia has become the subcontractor now. So publicly in the United Nations, they oppose Russia's war in Ukraine, because this is an issue of self-determination and the international order, and if sovereignty and non-interference is eroded, this is a big problem for many countries. That's why they vote no in the UN General assembly. But you know, this is something that Europe has to actively see. Many of them, they might not want to align, but there's a lot to offer. And that's, I think, why this outreach is very important in creating global partnerships. And traditionally, I would say the European Union is good in that. There's a track record of the European Union, already of the European community, in creating these agreement-based linkages with third countries and group of countries. So that is also an element of the European strategy that I consider very important in that regard.
That is very, very important, and we don't mention this enough for sure, because especially now also that I can turn towards my question on Ukraine, another question that kills, because there's such a huge influence of these states that are in between several multipolar positions that align with one or the other, that has a huge influence on the war in Ukraine right now. And Europe, what kind of influence can Europe have actually on that is another question. We don't have the time for to talk about this, but the question I would like to ask you, a very, very short answer. Try to be as short as possible because we have 10 minutes. We had yesterday a panel on Ukraine. I encourage you to watch it online again, where we focused on different perspectives on the war, but we did not mention other alternatives and different outcomes that we can have. Because obviously we want to develop a liberal democratic outcome in Ukraine, but this is not the only possible outcome. What do we do if Ukraine turns towards something else? And please, I give the floor to Pam to answer that.
Okay, right. In part, I think there are several things that we have to think about in terms of Ukraine. Right? I think there, first of all, needs to be an understanding, both within Europe and in the United States, right, that this is likely to be a prolonged war. And it might take many years, and it will certainly require a sustained commitment. Right? I don't see it ending anytime soon. I think despite its weaknesses and losses, Russia will continue, and Putin will continue to wage this war in a very brutal manner, right? And that's going to mean that Ukraine is going to continue to need substantial aid, right? Military aid, humanitarian aid, financial aid, right? And it's important that Ukraine make progress in the war, not just by repelling Russians, but also by re-winning territory that is lost. Because one of the problems that we see within the domestic publics, right, is that with a prolonged war, also support declines. And from an electoral standpoint, for politicians in a liberal democratic country, right, that is going to be problematic, particularly as you get closer to an election. Okay, so that's right, and so that you have to make sort of clear to the publics too why this is important. And you can't go out and say Russia is losing the war, and then people will have this expectation that suddenly Ukraine is going to win. And we've seen that in terms of some political rhetoric. I think, though, that what is really critical, right, is that more thought be given not to just what what the war looks like, right, and what the peace will look like, but then what is the future of Ukraine going to be, right? Because just because Ukraine wins the war doesn't mean that it will win the peace or that it will necessarily get a liberal democratic regime. Okay? There is this assumption that Ukraine is going to be a liberal democracy when the war ends. There is no guarantee. If we look at Ukraine before the war, there was weak state capacity, there are weak institutions, there was corruption, right? There was not an established political party system, right? And so, and there are going to be, in that transition, because transitions are always very dangerous, treacherous times, there are going to be political entrepreneurs who are going to try to mobilize support based on either nationalistic claims, right, or they're going to say, these Western countries are trying to dictate what our liberal democracy should look like, or because the EU is going to say, you have to meet certain criteria in order to actually become a member of the club, right? And you have to do this, this, this before you can become a member of the club. You know, there'll be some politicians in Ukraine who will say, oh, why should they dictate, right, what we do? And we've seen this, right? I mean, we've seen this both internally in the EU, but you also see it externally, and you also see what happens when you have, or potentially what happens when you have prolonged accession, right? Think about Turkey, okay, for example, all right? And so there have to be plans made already now, right, for how these things are going to be dealt with, right? What's going to happen, right, too, because if Ukraine does become a member of the EU, Ukraine is a very large state. It will shift the dynamics within the EU, right? What is it going to mean in terms of decision-making power within the EU, and how will decisions be made? Because that will also play out in terms of the legitimacy of the EU and also what the domestic publics within the EU think, right? And so I think that there has to be much more discussion already now about where we're going to go post-war, right? And also plans for reconstruction, for monitoring the flow of money, for building institutions in civil society, right? And for thinking about how the progression is going to work in terms of incorporating the Ukraine into the liberal democratic sphere. And I think that sometimes that, right, is not, we don't, you know, we focus on the war because, and Ukrainians clearly have to focus on the war because that is the most important short-term goal, right?
Yep.
Because because winning becomes very important in that regard, and without that, right, we're not going to be able to do this. So that has to be the first priority, but people have to already be thinking about these other things as well.
So important, so important. Yes, definitely, because we don't have so much time actually to prepare for this transition. And there have been some questions also online regarding the danger of future democratic backslidings in Ukraine, considering the concentration of the executive powers and corruption. Muriel, how do you see?
Yeah, so as you were talking, I'm trying to sketch a very quick two-scenario hypothesis. Scenario one, as Pam said, low-intensity conflict, protracted conflict, with powerful China playing out weak but scary Russia in Europe. Because it's important to remember that Russia scares Europe, but is actually weak and has actually few chips to push in the game. But that works, and China's red line will be sovereignty, which of course helps Russia. So scenario one is a kind of a new Cold War scenario, and we can modify and tweak certain variables that I don't all have in control myself, but we need to think in those terms. I think this is the realist picture. Yeah. Second picture, peace agreement, highly optimistic. Peace agreement with a federal Ukraine, maybe, backed by a new directoire of new powers, and so the big question is, who are the new powers, the new powerful of this world? And obviously China wants to be part of it. So here we hit a sensitive point of the current, hectic world order, which is that we can no longer pretend that the powerful are just the few, the happy few that have ruled the world so far. It has created too much humiliation, to use Bertrand Bady's term. Humiliation has become a force of international relations for very systemic reasons that are ingrained in our international system. And here we have a case study, So if this is the alternative, then we have to specify certain variables, how to sell this to China, how to engage China, what will happen of Turkey, of Iran, and especially in the US uncertainty hypothesis, and what about Russia without Putin, because Russia is not Putin, and so everybody dies. So this is my my 2-cent contribution to this very complex situation. As for Ukraine's future, yes, there is no guarantee that Ukraine will forever be democratic. in any case, we need to help, that's for sure. And we've seen that Ukraine was, in the past tied to Russia, and this grotesque escape to Russia of the former president in 2014. So we absolutely need to provide as much soft power and help and support to civil society, so that when comes the leader, he's the good one, so to speak. And I would say we need to do that with Russia as well. Yes. So these are my little 2 cents contributions.
Let's see how that goes with Russia, obviously, but how we can also, us in Europe, try to develop much more capacity to help Ukraine on that road. Stefan, what is your answer regarding future possible scenarios in Ukraine, and actually also what that means for the international security architecture?
I had the advantage of first listening now to you and think of, my focus would be on three things Europe has to do, right? Two of them in relation to Ukraine. Two of them are not directly related to Ukraine, but extremely important. The first one is that a lot of how this will play out in Ukraine is decided in the Indo-Pacific region in relation to China and its nationalist ambitions there. So Europe should invest into this. In DC, this has been a debate for a long time. I remember that I was there in 2010, I think, and there was talk only about Asia. Back then, that was very far away from debates that happened in Europe. Europe was not focused on this region, but I think we have to. We have to focus on this region. And this is, by and large, this is a very geopolitical focus that Europe has to take on the Indo-Pacific region. Not just with the US, but also with local powers like Australia or India or the ASEAN states. They're all very important in that regard. Taiwan, of course, too. So Japan, South Korea, sorry. So that's the setting, the first setting. Because if this is stabilized and no conflict emerges there, this will have repercussions on Ukraine, right? Also, how far China is willing to invest into Russia. Of course, they do this and they will continue to do this, and that's why I share your assessment that this will be a protracted war. This is the most likely scenario. So Indo-Pacific. The other one is these global partnerships, because Europe has to connect to the vast part of the world where we see countries and regions who, first of all, they don't want to make a decision between the West and China. They just don't want to. And secondly, the Ukraine war is very far away from them. A colleague of mine just came back from Tanzania. Nobody talks about Ukraine there, right? They say that's a European problem. At last, you have your own problems, because traditionally, you talk about our conflicts. No, you have your one. You see how that is. We are not interested in Ukraine. This is the perspective. I've been to Jordan last week. They're not interested in Ukraine, in Latin America. But Europeans should very actively connect to these societies and to these states and to these regions on eye level, as I said before, because the agreements have to be made that are favorable to Europeans and societies in that region. And then the third one is the relationship with Ukraine. And I think there a clear path to integration into the European Union and NATO is what is required, because Ukraine, the post-war Ukraine, has to be firmly anchored in the European political and security structures, and the transatlantic ones, because everything else would be very dangerous, I think, in the mid and long run. So that's the third element of this scenario that I would consider important.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Europe has a lot to do. We have a lot to do, specifically the younger generations. Coming back to why we do the Young Security Conference, is that we try to foster more cooperation between scholars and policymakers and different generations, not only in Europe, but also throughout the world, and hopefully much more in the future. Unfortunately, I have to close this panel now because we are running already a little bit over time. I thank you so much for this amazing discussion. I would love to have more time. For those here in Munich, please do not hesitate to spam our speakers here inside and ask them your questions during lunch now. In any case, I would like also to invite the audience online to join our next sessions beginning at 1:30 on EU-NATO cooperation and then at 3:30 on the transatlantic cooperation. So 2 big, very important issues to discuss this afternoon. I thank you very much again for joining us here today in Munich at the America House. I thank our partners, and once again, a big thank you to the America House for hosting us here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.